The crystal wine glass trembled in my hand as Patricia raised her voice above the dinner conversation, her perfectly manicured finger pointing directly at me. Michael deserves so much better than an unemployed woman who can't even contribute to the household bills, she declared to the entire table at Romano Steakhouse. Sarah here has been living off my son's generosity for 3 years, while pretending to be some kind of entrepreneur. What Patricia didn't know was that the mortgage on her $2.3 million mansion in Brookfield Heights, the same house where she hosted her weekly bridge club to gossip about neighbors, was held by Pinnacle Financial Solutions. The company I'd built from nothing while she criticized my little computer hobby during every family gathering. The same company that had just approved a rate adjustment on her loan that morning. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 3 years earlier, I'd stood in the marble-floored lobby of Hartman & Associates, my laptop bag slung over my shoulder and determination coursing through my veins. I was Sarah Chen, 28 years old, with an MBA in finance from Northwestern and a burning ambition to revolutionize how people accessed home financing. More importantly, I was about to meet Michael Hartman, the charming loan officer who would become my husband and unwittingly provide the perfect cover for building my empire. Michael was everything his family expected. Tall, conventionally handsome, with the easy confidence that came from growing up in Brookfield Heights, where success was measured by the size of your driveway and the exclusivity of your country club membership. He worked at his father's established mortgage brokerage, Hartman Financial Group, a respectable but unremarkable firm that had been serving the Chicago suburbs for 30 years. "So you're in finance too?" he'd asked during our first coffee date at the trendy cafe downtown, his blue eyes lighting up with interest. "That's unusual. Most women I meet are in marketing or education." I should have recognized the subtle condescension in that statement, the unconscious bias that would later manifest in his family's treatment of me. Instead, I was charmed by his genuine curiosity about my background, my plans to start my own company, my vision for streamlining the mortgage application process through innovative technology. "I want to create something that makes homeownership accessible to people who've been shut out by traditional lending," I explained, watching his expression for signs of the dismissiveness I'd encountered from other men in the industry. Too many qualified buyers get lost in bureaucratic maze because the system wasn't designed with their needs in mind. Michael nodded enthusiastically, leaning forward with what seemed like genuine engagement. "That's incredible, Sarah. The industry definitely needs fresh thinking. My dad's always complaining about how slow everything moves, how much paperwork is involved in even simple transactions." In those early days, Michael seemed like the perfect partner. He understood the financial world enough to appreciate my ambitions, but wasn't so entrenched in traditional thinking that he couldn't envision change. When I talked about my plans for Pinnacle Financial Solutions, he offered encouragement and even practical suggestions based on his experience in the field. "You should definitely focus on the digital application process," he said during one of our long evening walks through Lincoln Park. "Half our clients get frustrated just trying to gather all the required documents. If you could streamline that somehow, you'd have a real competitive advantage." I took his advice seriously, incorporating user-friendly document upload systems and automated verification processes into my business plan. Looking back, I realized those conversations were among the last times Michael truly listened to my professional aspirations without the filter of his family's expectations clouding his perception. The Hartman family dinner where I was first introduced to his parents should have been a warning sign. Patricia Hartman, perfectly coiffed in her signature pearl necklace and Chanel suit, had greeted me with the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. Her handshake was brief, almost dismissive, as if physical contact with someone from my background might somehow contaminate her. "Sarah Chen," she repeated slowly, pronouncing my last name with exaggerated precision. "That's Chinese, isn't it? How interesting that Michael is branching out in his social circle." The comment stung, but I attributed it to generational differences and perhaps nervousness about meeting her son's new girlfriend. I was determined to prove myself worthy of their acceptance, to show them that despite my modest background, my parents owned a small accounting firm in Chinatown. I shared their values of hard work and financial success. Richard Hartman, Michael's father, had been marginally warmer. A stocky man with graying temples and the kind of firm handshake that suggested decades of closing deals, he at least showed interest in my educational background and career plans. When I mentioned my MBA and my intention to start a financial services company, he nodded approvingly. "Good field for someone with your background," he said, though I detected a subtle emphasis on your background that made me wonder what exactly he meant. "Lots of opportunity for small specialty firms to carve out niches. Michael's told us you're quite ambitious." At the time, I interpreted his words as encouraging. Only later would I understand that in the Hartman family lexicon, ambitious, when applied to women, often carried negative connotations, suggesting someone who didn't know her proper place in the social hierarchy they'd spent generations constructing. The dinner conversation that evening had been politely strained, with Patricia asking carefully worded questions designed to establish my social and economic credentials. Where had I grown up? What did my parents do for work? Where did I see myself in 5 years? Each query felt like a test I wasn't sure I was passing. "It's wonderful that you have such entrepreneurial spirit," Patricia said over the main course, her tone suggesting the opposite. "Of course, starting a business requires significant capital investment. Do you have family money to draw from, or will you be seeking investors?" The question was designed to expose what she suspected, that I lacked the financial resources to successfully launch a company in their rarefied world. What she couldn't have known was that I'd been saving and planning meticulously for years, living frugally while building my credit and networking with potential investors who valued innovation over pedigree. "I've been fortunate to connect with some forward-thinking venture capital firms," I replied diplomatically. "They're interested in funding companies that can disrupt traditional financial services through technology." It wasn't entirely true yet. I was still in the early stages of courting investors, but I wanted to signal that I wasn't some naive dreamer without practical resources. The slight tightening around Patricia's eyes suggested my answer hadn't provided the vulnerability she'd been fishing for. Michael, to his credit, had attempted to steer the conversation towards safer topics: his work at the family firm, local news, shared acquaintances. But I could see the wheels turning in his parents' minds, could practically hear them categorizing me as an outsider who needed to be managed rather than welcomed. After dinner, as we waited for the valet to bring Michael's BMW, Patricia had pulled me aside with what she probably thought was motherly concern. "Sarah, dear," she began, her voice honey-sweet with underlying steel, "I hope you understand that Michael has certain expectations for his future. The Hartman family has a reputation in this community, standards that have been built over generations. I'm sure you appreciate how important it is that whoever he chooses to settle down with can contribute appropriately to that legacy." The message was crystal clear. I wasn't good enough for their son, and they expected this relationship to run its natural course before anything serious developed. What Patricia didn't realize was that her subtle rejection only strengthened my resolve. I would build something so successful, so undeniably impressive, that even she would have to acknowledge my worth. That conversation sparked what would become my greatest professional achievement and personal vindication. Over the following months, as my relationship with Michael deepened and his family's subtle hostility became more apparent, I channeled my frustration into building Pinnacle Financial Solutions with laser-focused determination. I worked 18-hour days, developing proprietary algorithms for risk assessment that could process loan applications in hours rather than weeks. I cultivated relationships with real estate agents, financial advisors, and mortgage brokers who were frustrated with the limitations of traditional lenders. Most importantly, I identified underserved markets: young professionals, small business owners, immigrants with strong credit but limited traditional documentation, who were being overlooked by established firms like Hartman Financial Group. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was competing directly with Michael's family business, but I justified it as healthy market competition. Besides, Pinnacle was targeting a different customer base, focusing on efficiency and accessibility rather than the high-net-worth clients that Hartman Financial Group had served for decades. Michael was supportive of my efforts, at least initially. He celebrated when I secured my first round of venture capital funding, toasted my early client acquisitions, and seemed genuinely proud of my accomplishments. But I began to notice subtle changes in his enthusiasm as my company grew more successful. "Maybe you should slow down a little," he suggested one evening as I worked late on a presentation for potential investors. "You're working constantly. It's important to maintain work-life balance." The suggestion might have been motivated by genuine concern for my well-being, but it came at a time when Pinnacle was experiencing explosive growth. We'd just closed our largest month ever, processing over $50 million in loan applications with approval rates that exceeded industry standards. This wasn't the time to ease up. It was the moment to accelerate and consolidate our market position. This is a critical growth phase, I explained, trying to help him understand the opportunity we were capturing. If we can maintain this momentum for another 6 months, we'll be positioned to expand into new markets, maybe even go national. Michael's expression suggested he didn't quite grasp the significance of what I was building. In his world, success came gradually, through incremental improvements to established processes. The idea of rapid scaling, of disrupting entire industries through innovation, seemed to make him uncomfortable. His discomfort became more pronounced after we got engaged, and I began spending more time with his extended family. Patricia's criticism, initially subtle, grew more direct as it became clear that my little business wasn't a temporary phase I'd outgrow once I settled into the role of Michael's wife. "When are you planning to start a family?" she asked during one particularly uncomfortable Sunday brunch. "I hope you're not one of those career women who thinks she can have everything. Children need their mother's attention, especially in the early years." The assumption that I would naturally subordinate my professional ambitions to domestic responsibilities was infuriating, but I'd learned to respond diplomatically rather than defensively. Patricia was looking for evidence that I was selfish or unrealistic about the sacrifices required for marriage and motherhood. "Michael and I are focused on building strong foundations right now," I replied carefully, "both personally and professionally. When we're ready to start a family, we'll make sure we can provide the best possible environment for our children." It was a non-answer that sidestepped her attempt to force me into declaring my priorities, but I could see the frustration in her eyes. She wanted me to admit that my career was just a hobby, something I'd abandon when real responsibilities called. My refusal to provide that satisfaction only intensified her disapproval. Meanwhile, Pinnacle Financial Solutions continued its remarkable growth trajectory. We'd expanded from a single office in downtown Chicago to satellite locations in Milwaukee, Indianapolis, and Detroit. Our loan portfolio had grown to over $500 million, and we were being courted by major banks interested in either partnership or acquisition. The success was everything I'd dreamed of and more, but it came with an unexpected cost: the growing distance between Michael and me as his family's influence gradually eroded his initial support for my ambitions. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The wedding planning process revealed the true extent of Patricia Hartman's need for control and her growing resentment toward my independence. What should have been a joyful collaboration between families became a carefully orchestrated campaign to establish her dominance over every aspect of my future life. "I've taken the liberty of making appointments with 3 wedding planners," Patricia announced during what was supposed to be a casual lunch at the Oak Brook Country Club. She slid a leather-bound folder across the pristine white tablecloth, her manicured nails drumming against the surface with barely contained impatience. "Veronica Ashworth is particularly sought after. She did the Wellington wedding last spring. Absolutely divine." I opened the folder to find detailed portfolios of wedding planners whose estimated costs exceeded the down payment on most people's first homes. Each portfolio included sample events that looked more like corporate galas than intimate celebrations of love. Crystal chandeliers, imported flowers, orchestras instead of bands. Everything calculated to impress rather than reflect the couple's personal style. "These are certainly impressive," I said diplomatically, already calculating that any one of these planners would cost more than Pinnacle's entire first-year marketing budget. "Michael and I were actually thinking of something more intimate, maybe something outdoors, more reflective of our personalities." The suggestion landed like a physical blow. Patricia's perfectly composed expression flickered momentarily, revealing the steel beneath her society matron facade. "Outdoor weddings are so unpredictable," she said, her tone suggesting I'd proposed getting married in a gas station. "Weather, insects, inadequate facilities for proper catering. The Hartman family has certain standards to maintain. There it was again. The constant reminder that I was marrying into their world, not creating a new one with Michael. Every decision became a test of whether I would submit to their vision or assert my own preferences. The wedding wasn't about celebrating our love. It was about demonstrating my willingness to conform to their expectations. Michael, caught between his mother's forceful personality and my growing frustration, attempted diplomatic neutrality that satisfied no one. "Mom, maybe we could look at some outdoor venues that still have elegant facilities," he suggested weakly. "Some of those garden venues can be really beautiful." Patricia's smile was razor sharp. "Of course, darling. I'm sure we can find something appropriate." The emphasis on appropriate made it clear that my preferences would be tolerated only if they aligned with her standards of what befitted the Hartman name. Meanwhile, my professional life was reaching new heights of success that I couldn't fully share with my future family. Pinnacle Financial Solutions had just closed a major partnership deal with Midwest Community Bank, giving us access to their branch network across Illinois, Wisconsin, and Indiana. The agreement would triple our lending capacity and establish us as a serious player in the regional mortgage market. The signing ceremony took place in the gleaming conference room of Midwest Community's headquarters, surrounded by executives who treated me with the respect my accomplishments had earned. CEO Margaret Rodriguez, a formidable woman in her 50s who'd built the bank from a single branch into a regional powerhouse, shook my hand with genuine warmth. "Sarah, this partnership represents exactly the kind of innovation our industry needs," she said, her words carrying the weight of someone who understood the significance of what I'd built. "Your approval rates and processing times are setting new standards. We're excited to see what we can accomplish together." Sitting in that boardroom, surrounded by financial leaders who valued my expertise and vision, I felt the stark contrast with my personal life. Here, I was Sarah Chen, successful entrepreneur and industry innovator. At Hartman family gatherings, I was the Chinese woman who didn't quite understand her place in their carefully constructed social hierarchy. The partnership announcement made regional business headlines, including a feature in Chicago Business Journal that highlighted Pinnacle's disruption of traditional lending practices. I was profiled as one of 30 under 30 financial innovators, with quotes praising our customer-centric approach and technological advancement. I shared the article with Michael over dinner at our favorite Italian restaurant, expecting him to share my excitement about the recognition. Instead, he studied the piece with a furrowed brow, his attention seeming to focus on details that had nothing to do with my professional achievement. "This mentions that you're processing loans for clients that traditional banks turn down," he said, setting the magazine aside with obvious concern. "That sounds risky. What if these borrowers default at higher rates?" The question revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of my business model. Pinnacle wasn't taking on riskier clients. We were using better data analysis and more sophisticated underwriting to identify qualified borrowers that traditional institutions overlooked due to outdated criteria or institutional bias. "Our default rates are actually below industry averages," I explained, trying to help him understand the innovation behind our success. "We're not lowering standards. We're using better tools to assess creditworthiness. Traditional banks rely on criteria that were developed decades ago and don't reflect modern financial realities." Michael nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. His experience at Hartman Financial Group had taught him that safe lending meant sticking to established practices, avoiding anything that deviated from proven formulas. The idea that innovation could actually reduce risk while expanding opportunities was foreign to his conservative training. "Maybe you should consider slowing the expansion," he suggested, echoing his earlier concerns about work-life balance. "Focus on consolidating what you've already built, instead of constantly pushing for more growth." The suggestion struck me as particularly frustrating given that Michael worked in the same industry and should have understood the competitive dynamics at play. Mortgage lending was becoming increasingly competitive, with new fintech companies entering the market regularly. Slowing expansion would mean ceding territory to competitors who were aggressively pursuing the same opportunities. "This is exactly the time to accelerate," I explained, pulling up Pinnacle's quarterly projections on my phone. "We have first-mover advantage in several key markets, but only if we can establish dominant positions before competitors catch up." Waiting means losing the opportunity entirely. Michael's expression suggested he found my drive for continued growth unsettling rather than impressive. In his family's world, success was measured by stability and steady progress, not the rapid scaling that characterized modern business innovation. My ambition, which had initially attracted him, was beginning to feel threatening to his sense of how our future should unfold. The tension between my professional success and family expectations came to a head during the engagement party Patricia organized at the Hartman family estate. The sprawling colonial mansion in Brookfield Heights showcased 3 generations of accumulated wealth, from Persian rugs that cost more than most people's annual salaries, to oil paintings that had been handed down through blue-blooded lineages. Patricia had invited what she termed appropriate social connections, a carefully curated guest list of business leaders, society matrons, and family friends, whose presence would affirm the Hartman family's status within their community. The guest list notably excluded anyone from my professional network, despite my suggestions that some of my business associates might appreciate the invitation. "This is a family celebration," Patricia had explained when I mentioned inviting Margaret Rodriguez, or some of the venture capital partners who had supported Pinnacle's growth. "We want to keep it intimate, focused on people who really know Michael." The implicit message was clear. My professional achievements and the relationships I'd built were peripheral to what really mattered: my acceptance into their established social circle. The people who respected my business acumen were irrelevant compared to those who could validate my worthiness as Michael's future wife. During the party, I found myself relegated to conversations about wedding planning, home decoration, and other topics deemed appropriate for a future Hartman daughter-in-law. When guests asked about my work, Patricia would smoothly redirect the conversation before I could provide any substantive details about Pinnacle's success. "Sarah has been keeping busy with her little consulting business," she would say, with a patronizing smile that minimized years of intensive work into a hobby-level activity. "But of course, once she and Michael settle down properly, she'll have other priorities to focus on." The dismissal was infuriating, particularly because it happened repeatedly throughout the evening. Every attempt I made to discuss my professional accomplishments was deflected or minimized, as if acknowledging my success would somehow diminish the narrative Patricia preferred, that I was lucky to be marrying into their family rather than bringing value of my own. The most telling moment came when James Wellington, whose daughter's wedding Patricia had referenced earlier, approached our conversation group. A distinguished man in his 60s who owned a successful real estate development company, he seemed genuinely interested when someone mentioned my work in financial services. "Mortgage lending is such a dynamic field right now," he said, his tone suggesting real engagement with the topic. "I've been hearing about innovative companies that are streamlining the approval process. Have you encountered any of these new players in your work?" It was the perfect opening to discuss Pinnacle's market position and innovations, but before I could respond, Patricia smoothly intervened. "Sarah's been exploring various consulting opportunities," she said, her hand briefly touching my arm in what appeared to be a supportive gesture but felt like a warning. "Nothing too demanding, of course. We're all looking forward to her focusing on the really important things once the wedding is behind us." James nodded politely, but I caught a flicker of confusion in his expression. Here was a man who clearly understood business and might have been interested in a substantive conversation about industry trends, yet he was being told that I was essentially dabbling in consulting work rather than running a rapidly growing company. The pattern repeated throughout the evening. Every conversation that touched on my professional life was redirected, minimized, or reframed to emphasize my future domestic role rather than my current achievements. By the end of the night, any guest who bothered to remember me would think of me as Michael's fiancé, who did some unspecified consulting work, not as the founder and CEO of one of the region's fastest-growing financial services companies. Later that evening, as Michael and I drove home through the tree-lined streets of Brookfield Heights, I struggled to articulate my frustration, without seeming ungrateful for his family's efforts to welcome me. "Your mother put a lot of work into tonight," I began carefully, testing the waters for a conversation about what had transpired, though I was hoping to connect more with some of the business people who were there. Michael glanced at me with surprise, as if the idea hadn't occurred to him. "You seem to be getting along well with everyone. Mom was really pleased with how smoothly everything went." His response revealed how differently we'd experienced the same evening. Where I'd felt systematically silenced and diminished, he'd seen successful social integration. The disconnect was revealing and troubling. If Michael couldn't recognize when I was being marginalized, how would he defend my interests in future family dynamics? I felt like every time someone asked about my work, the conversation got redirected, I explained, hoping he would understand my perspective. It would have been nice to actually discuss what I do with people who might find it interesting. Mom probably just wanted to keep things light, Michael replied, his tone suggesting he saw nothing problematic about the pattern I'd described. Business talk can get pretty dry at social events. She was probably trying to keep the conversation flowing. The rationalization stung because it revealed how little Michael understood about what had really happened. Patricia hadn't been managing conversation flow. She'd been controlling my narrative, ensuring that any guest who met me would see me as an extension of the Hartman family rather than as an accomplished professional in my own right. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing loan applications in my corner office overlooking Lake Michigan. My assistant, Rebecca, knocked softly before entering with an expression that suggested something significant was about to unfold. "Sarah, I have Marcus Thompson from Premier Properties on line 2, she said, her voice barely containing excitement. "He says it's about a major acquisition opportunity that just became available." Marcus Thompson was one of Chicago's most respected commercial real estate brokers, the kind of man who moved 8-figure deals with handshake agreements, and whose client list read like a who's who of Midwest business leaders. When Marcus called personally rather than going through intermediaries, it meant something substantial was in motion. "Marcus," I answered, settling back in my chair as I watched morning commuters streaming along Lakeshore Drive, 40 floors below. "What kind of opportunity are we talking about?" "The kind that doesn't come around often," he replied, his characteristic gravitas suggesting this wasn't a routine pitch. "Hartman Financial Group is being quietly shopped. Richard wants to retire, but he's being very discreet about the process. No public listings, no investment banking presentations, just private conversations with select potential buyers." The irony hit me like a physical blow. My future father-in-law was selling the family business, and I was hearing about it from a real estate broker rather than from Michael or anyone in the Hartman family. More significantly, Hartman Financial Group represented exactly the kind of acquisition target that could accelerate Pinnacle's growth trajectory exponentially. "What's the asking price range?" I asked, my mind already calculating the strategic implications of such a purchase. 15 to 20 million, depending on the final valuation of their loan portfolio, Marcus replied. "They've got solid market position in the northwest suburbs, established client relationships, good regulatory standing. The only issue is that the business model is pretty traditional. They haven't invested much in technology or process innovation," which was exactly why Pinnacle could transform their operation into something far more valuable. "Our technological infrastructure could streamline their cumbersome processes. Our risk assessment algorithms could improve their approval rates, and our expanded lending criteria could tap into markets they'd never effectively served. I'll need complete financials and a detailed breakdown of their current operations," I said, already envisioning how such an acquisition could position Pinnacle as the dominant regional player. "Can you arrange a confidential review?" "Absolutely." Richard specifically mentioned wanting to consider buyers who would preserve the Hartman legacy while bringing fresh perspectives to the business. "Given your reputation in the industry, I think you'd be an ideal candidate." After ending the call, I sat in stunned silence, processing the implications of what I'd just learned. The Hartman family business that had been used to measure my worth for the past 3 years, the established firm that represented everything Patricia considered properly respectable, was actually struggling enough that Richard was ready to sell. More troubling was the realization that Michael had never mentioned his father's retirement plans or the family's financial concerns. Either he was being kept in the dark about his own family's business decisions, or he was deliberately withholding information that could significantly impact our shared future. That evening, I decided to test the waters with Michael over dinner at home. I'd prepared his favorite meal, grilled salmon with rosemary potatoes, hoping to create a relaxed atmosphere for what might be a difficult conversation. "How are things going at your dad's firm?" I asked casually while we ate, watching his expression for any signs of stress or concealment. "You haven't mentioned work much lately." Michael paused mid-bite, his fork hovering over his plate as if weighing how much to reveal. "Things are fine," he said finally, his tone carefully neutral. Why do you ask? The evasiveness was telling. In our early relationship, Michael had been open about workplace challenges, sharing stories about difficult clients or celebrating successful deals. His sudden reluctance to discuss his professional life suggested something significant was happening that he didn't want to share. Just curious, I replied, maintaining the casual tone while probing a bit deeper. I ran into someone in the industry who mentioned that a lot of traditional mortgage brokers are facing increased competition these days. Wondered if you guys were feeling any pressure. Every business faces competition, Michael answered, his defensiveness confirming my suspicions that Hartman Financial Group was dealing with more serious challenges than he'd admitted. Dad's been in this business for 30 years. He knows how to adapt to changing markets. The conversation died there, with Michael clearly unwilling to provide any real insight into his family's situation. His secrecy stung, particularly because I'd been transparent about Pinnacle's growth, challenges, and strategic decisions throughout our relationship. The information asymmetry suggested a fundamental lack of trust that I found deeply unsettling. Over the following days, I conducted discrete research into Hartman Financial Group's market position and financial health. What I discovered painted a picture of a company struggling to compete in an increasingly sophisticated marketplace. Their loan processing times averaged 6 weeks compared to Pinnacle's 7-day turnaround. Their approval rates had declined steadily over the past 3 years, as their conservative underwriting criteria eliminated potential borrowers who were being successfully served by more innovative competitors. Most tellingly, their market share in key suburban markets had eroded significantly, as younger homebuyers gravitated toward lenders who offered streamlined digital experiences and faster approvals. The Hartman name still carried weight among older, established clients, but the next generation of borrowers was choosing companies like Pinnacle that prioritized efficiency and customer service over traditional prestige. The due diligence process confirmed what I'd suspected. Hartman Financial Group was a perfect acquisition target for Pinnacle. Their established client relationships and regulatory compliance history would complement our technological capabilities and innovative processes. More importantly, purchasing the firm would give us instant credibility with the conservative customer base that had been resistant to our newer, less traditional approach. From a purely business perspective, acquiring Hartman Financial Group was an obvious strategic choice. From a personal perspective, it represented something far more complex. The opportunity to literally own the business that had been used to judge my worthiness as a future family member. The psychological appeal was undeniable. For 3 years, I'd endured subtle and not-so-subtle suggestions that my entrepreneurial efforts were somehow less legitimate than the established success of the Hartman family business. Patricia had repeatedly implied that my little consulting company could never compete with the respectability and stability that came from generations of business success. Purchasing their struggling firm would reverse that power dynamic entirely. Instead of being the outsider seeking acceptance into their established world, I would become the successful entrepreneur acquiring their family legacy. The irony was almost too perfect to resist. But beyond the personal satisfaction, the acquisition made compelling financial sense. My investment team had run comprehensive models showing that combining Pinnacle's operations with Hartman Financial Group's assets could create a regional powerhouse capable of competing with much larger national firms. The synergies were obvious, the strategic fit was perfect, and the asking price was well within our current financial capacity. I spent sleepless nights weighing the ethical implications of purchasing my future in-laws' business without revealing my identity as the buyer. On one hand, business was business. If Richard was selling to the highest qualified bidder, my personal relationship to the family shouldn't disqualify me from competing. On the other hand, the secrecy felt deceptive, particularly given Michael's obvious stress about his family's situation. The decision crystallized during another uncomfortable family dinner at the Hartman estate. Patricia had been particularly critical that evening, questioning my decision to work late instead of attending her bridge club's charity luncheon. "I simply don't understand this obsession with work," she said while Richard carved the roast, her tone suggesting genuine bewilderment at my priorities. "Michael works hard, certainly, but he understands the importance of social obligations and family commitments. A wife needs to support her husband's social standing, not constantly prioritize her own little projects. The dismissal of my professional achievements as little projects was particularly galling given what I now knew about their family's financial situation. Here was a woman whose own family business was failing, yet she had the audacity to criticize the success I'd built from nothing. My work is more than just projects, I replied, trying to maintain diplomatic composure despite my growing frustration. Pinnacle Financial Solutions has become one of the region's fastest-growing mortgage companies. We're actually expanding into new markets next quarter. Patricia's expression suggested she found my success claims either exaggerated or irrelevant. "How nice, dear," she said dismissively. "Though I do hope you're not overextending yourself. Small businesses can be so unpredictable, especially when they try to grow too quickly." The irony was breathtaking. The woman whose family business was secretly being shopped for sale was lecturing me about the risks of overextension. Her condescension, combined with Michael's continued secrecy about his family's struggles, finally pushed me past the point of maintaining polite discretion. "Actually, we've been approached about several acquisition opportunities," I said, watching Patricia's face for any flicker of recognition or concern. "Established firms that are looking for strategic partnerships or outright purchase by companies with stronger growth prospects." Richard looked up from his carving with sudden interest, his business instincts clearly engaged despite the family dinner setting. "What kind of firms?" he asked, his tone suggesting more than casual curiosity. "Traditional mortgage brokers, mostly," I replied, maintaining eye contact with my future father-in-law. "Companies with good reputations but outdated processes. The kind of businesses that could benefit significantly from technological modernization and expanded lending criteria." The description was specific enough that anyone familiar with the local market would recognize it as applying to firms like Hartman Financial Group. Richard's slight pause before continuing to carve suggested he'd made that connection, though he showed no outward sign of concern. "Interesting," he said finally. "That's quite a competitive market, a lot of established players with deep roots in their communities." "True," I agreed. "But market loyalty only goes so far when customers are looking for better service and faster approvals. Even the most established firms can struggle if they don't adapt to changing expectations." Patricia, who had been following this exchange with growing irritation, decided to reassert control over the conversation. "Well, I'm sure that's all fascinating for people in the business," she said with obvious dismissal. "But perhaps we could discuss something more appropriate for family dinner." Her intervention prevented further exploration of the topic, but I'd seen enough of Richard's reaction to confirm my suspicions. He was worried about his firm's competitive position, and my description of acquisition targets had clearly resonated with his understanding of his own situation. That night, lying in bed next to Michael, who had remained conspicuously silent during the dinner conversation about business acquisitions, I made my final decision. If the Hartman family insisted on treating my professional success as irrelevant, while simultaneously struggling with their own business challenges, then I would demonstrate exactly how relevant my achievements had become. I would purchase Hartman Financial Group through Pinnacle, but I would structure the acquisition to remain confidential until the timing was right for a dramatic revelation. The purchase would be legitimate, fair, and beneficial to all parties involved, but the moment of disclosure would be entirely under my control, allowing me to choose when and how to demonstrate the true scope of my success to people who had spent years questioning my worth. The conference room at Davidson & Associates smelled of polished mahogany and decades of high-stakes negotiations. 27 floors above Chicago's financial district, the city sprawled beneath us like a board game, where I was about to make the most significant move of my career. Across the gleaming table sat Richard Hartman, his attorney, and Marcus Thompson, none of them aware that the mysterious buyer they'd been negotiating with for the past 6 weeks was currently engaged to Richard's son. "Ms. Chen," Richard said, extending his hand with the firm grip that had closed thousands of mortgage deals over 3 decades. "I have to admit, I'm impressed by Pinnacle's proposal. Your acquisition terms are more than fair, and your plans for modernizing our operations show real vision." The irony of receiving praise from my future father-in-law, who had spent years questioning my business acumen through subtle dismissals and patronizing comments, was almost overwhelming. Here, in the neutral territory of a legal conference room where my identity as Michael's fiancé was irrelevant, Richard was treating me with the professional respect that had been conspicuously absent from family gatherings. "Thank you, Mr. Hartman," I replied, maintaining the formal tone that had characterized our negotiations. Hartman Financial Group has built an impressive legacy. Our goal is to honor that foundation while positioning the combined entity for sustained growth in an evolving marketplace. My attorney, Jennifer Walsh, slid the final purchase agreements across the table with practiced efficiency. After weeks of due diligence, negotiations, and legal review, we were minutes away from completing a transaction that would fundamentally alter the dynamics of my personal and professional life. "The purchase price is $18.5 million, Jennifer summarized, with Pinnacle Financial Solutions acquiring all assets, client portfolios, and operational licenses of Hartman Financial Group. Mr. Hartman will remain as a consulting advisor for 6 months to ensure smooth transition, after which he'll be free to pursue his well-deserved retirement." Richard nodded approvingly as he reviewed the terms one final time. "I appreciate the transition period," he said. 30 years of client relationships deserve careful handling. I want to make sure everyone is properly taken care of during the change." His concern for his clients' welfare revealed a side of Richard that I rarely saw during family interactions. The thoughtful businessman who had built something meaningful, rather than the intimidating patriarch who judged my worthiness to marry his son. In this context, I could understand why Michael respected his father's accomplishments, even as I resented the way those accomplishments had been used to diminish my own. "Client retention is our top priority," I assured him. "We've prepared personalized transition plans for each major account, and our customer service standards will actually improve response times and approval processes." What I didn't mention was that I'd already identified several Hartman clients who had been underserved by their conservative lending criteria, qualified borrowers who had been turned away due to outdated risk assessment models. Under Pinnacle's management, these relationships could be salvaged and expanded, potentially increasing the firm's profitability within the first quarter. The signing process took nearly 2 hours, with both legal teams reviewing every clause and contingency. As Richard's pen moved across the final signature page, officially transferring ownership of his life's work to Pinnacle Financial Solutions, I felt a complex mixture of triumph and trepidation. The business victory was undeniable. I had just acquired one of the region's most established mortgage firms at a price that would prove profitable within 18 months. But the personal implications were staggering and unpredictable. "Congratulations, Miss Chen," Marcus said as we stood to shake hands. "This acquisition positions Pinnacle as a major regional player. I suspect you'll be fielding calls from national firms interested in partnerships within the year." He was probably right. The combined entity would control nearly 15% of the Chicago metropolitan mortgage market, with expansion opportunities into Wisconsin and Indiana that could easily double our market share within 2 years. From a purely strategic perspective, purchasing Hartman Financial Group was the most significant decision in Pinnacle's brief but remarkable history. After the other parties left, Jennifer and I remained in the conference room to discuss implementation timelines and integration strategies. As my attorney for both business and personal matters, she was one of the few people who understood the full complexity of what I'd just accomplished. "So," she said, closing her legal portfolio with a satisfied smile, "when do you plan to tell the Hartman family that you now own their business?" The question I'd been avoiding for weeks. Throughout the acquisition process, I'd focused on financial analysis, legal structures, and operational integration plans. Anything to avoid confronting the eventual necessity of revealing my identity to Michael and his family. "I'm not sure," I admitted, staring out at the Chicago skyline where somewhere in the suburban sprawl, Michael was probably finishing another day at the office, unaware that his employer had just changed. Part of me wants to tell Michael immediately. The secrecy feels dishonest, especially since we're supposed to be building a life together based on trust and transparency. "But?" Jennifer prompted, recognizing that my hesitation suggested deeper considerations. "But another part of me thinks this might be the only opportunity I'll ever have to demonstrate my actual capabilities to his family," I continued. "For 3 years, they've treated my success as either irrelevant or potentially problematic. Patricia constantly implies that I'm some kind of gold digger who doesn't understand the responsibilities of marriage into their social class, Maybe they need to confront the reality that I'm not the dependent outsider they've imagined. Jennifer nodded thoughtfully. As a successful attorney who had navigated her own share of professional and personal challenges, she understood the complicated dynamics of proving oneself in environments that questioned your legitimacy. There's also the practical consideration, she added. If you reveal the acquisition immediately, the Hartman family might feel deceived or manipulated, which could damage your relationship with Michael permanently. But if you wait too long, they might feel that the deception itself was a betrayal of trust. The timing dilemma was paralyzing. Revealing the acquisition too early would rob me of the opportunity to demonstrate my capabilities, when the family inevitably faced financial pressures they couldn't solve independently. But waiting too long risked creating a foundation of dishonesty that could undermine my marriage before it even began. What would you do? I asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. Jennifer considered the question carefully before responding. I think I'd give myself a deadline, she said finally. Maybe 6 months to see how the family dynamics evolve and whether Michael becomes more honest about his family's situation. If he doesn't start trusting you with the truth about their financial struggles, then the relationship has bigger problems than this acquisition. Her advice resonated with my own instincts. 6 months would give me time to integrate the two companies successfully, demonstrate Pinnacle's ability to improve Hartman's operations, and see whether Michael's secrecy about his family's business problems was temporary or indicative of deeper trust issues. The drive back to my downtown loft gave me time to process the magnitude of what I'd accomplished. In a single afternoon, I'd transformed Pinnacle from a promising startup into a regional powerhouse. More personally, I'd acquired the business that had been used as a measuring stick for my own professional worth, purchasing it at a fair price from people who had no idea they were selling to the woman they'd spent years underestimating. The psychological satisfaction was intense but complicated. I felt vindicated, certainly, but also somewhat hollow. The victory was meaningful only if it eventually led to genuine recognition and respect from people whose opinions shouldn't have mattered so much to my self-worth. That evening, Michael arrived home from work with obvious stress etched across his features. His usual easy smile was replaced by the kind of tension that suggested significant workplace pressures, confirming my suspicions that the Hartman family had been struggling with their business challenges for months. Rough day? I asked, pouring him a glass of the wine we'd been saving for special occasions. The irony of celebrating my acquisition of his family's business with wine intended for happy moments wasn't lost on me. Dad's been acting strange lately, Michael admitted, accepting the glass gratefully. Lots of closed-door meetings, conversations that stop when I walk into the room. I'm starting to wonder if there's something he's not telling me about the business. The opening was perfect for me to reveal what I knew about his family's situation, but I found myself hesitating. If Michael was genuinely concerned about his father's secrecy, wouldn't he have asked more direct questions or demanded inclusion in important business discussions? His passive acceptance of being excluded suggested either unusual naivete or a deeper pattern of avoiding difficult conversations within his family. Have you asked him directly? I probed, testing whether Michael was willing to confront uncomfortable truths when they affected his family's stability. I've tried, he said, though his tone suggested his attempts had been half-hearted. But you know how he is, very private about business matters, especially when he's dealing with challenges. I figure he'll tell me what I need to know when the time is right. The response revealed everything I needed to know about Michael's approach to difficult family dynamics. Rather than demanding transparency about matters that directly affected his future, he was content to wait passively for information to be shared voluntarily. This pattern of conflict avoidance explained much about his inability to defend me against his mother's subtle hostilities. He simply wasn't equipped to handle confrontational situations that might disrupt family harmony. What if the timing is never right? I asked gently. What if he's dealing with something serious that requires family support or input? Michael's expression suggested the possibility hadn't occurred to him. In his world, parents handled business problems independently while children waited respectfully for appropriate disclosure. The idea that he might have a right or responsibility to demand inclusion in discussions affecting his professional future seemed foreign to his understanding of family hierarchies. I trust Dad's judgment, he said finally. If he needed my help or wanted my input, he'd ask for it. The conversation died there, with Michael retreating into his characteristic avoidance of potentially uncomfortable topics. As we ate dinner in relative silence, I realized that my 6-month timeline might be overly optimistic. Michael's fundamental inability to confront difficult truths, whether about his family's business problems or his mother's treatment of me, suggested deeper character issues that wouldn't resolve themselves simply with the passage of time. That night, as I lay awake listening to Michael's peaceful breathing beside me, I contemplated the strange position I'd created for myself. I now owned the business where my fiancé worked, employed the father whose approval I'd been seeking, and held financial power over the family that had spent years questioning my worthiness. The reversal was complete but secret, creating a dynamic that felt both empowering and deeply isolating. The real test would come when the Hartman family inevitably discovered the truth about their new employer. Their reaction would reveal whether they were capable of respecting my achievements when those achievements couldn't be dismissed or minimized, or whether their need to maintain social hierarchy would trump their ability to acknowledge my success. Either way, I would finally have my answer about whether marriage into the Hartman family was compatible with remaining true to myself. The integration of Hartman Financial Group into Pinnacle's operations required a delicate balance of operational efficiency and personal secrecy that tested every aspect of my management skills. For 3 months following the acquisition, I maintained the fiction that I was simply running my own consulting business, while secretly orchestrating the transformation of my future father-in-law's struggling company into a model of modern mortgage lending. The irony of the situation became apparent during my first official visit to the Hartman offices as the new owner. Richard had requested a meeting with Ms. Chen from Pinnacle to discuss integration timelines and client transition protocols. As I walked through the familiar lobby where I'd waited for Michael during our early dating days, I saw the space through completely different eyes. Not as the impressive headquarters of an established family business, but as outdated infrastructure that needed immediate modernization. Ms. Chen, Richard greeted me with professional warmth, completely unaware that we'd shared Thanksgiving dinner just 2 months earlier. Thank you for making time for this meeting. I wanted to discuss the timeline for implementing your new client management systems. The surreal nature of the conversation, my future father-in-law addressing me with business formality while remaining oblivious to our personal connection, highlighted just how completely my professional identity had been compartmentalized in his mind. At family gatherings, I was Sarah the outsider, who didn't quite understand their world. In business settings, I was Ms. Chen, the successful entrepreneur whose innovations could save his life's work. Of course, Mr. Hartman, I replied, maintaining the professional distance that had characterized our negotiations. Our technology team has prepared a comprehensive implementation plan that should minimize disruption to your existing clients while significantly improving processing times. What I didn't mention was that I'd spent the previous weekend analyzing client files in excruciating detail, identifying dozens of missed opportunities, where the old Hartman approach had failed borrowers who would have been easily approved under Pinnacle's more sophisticated risk assessment models. The lost revenue from these missed opportunities likely exceeded $2 million annually, money that could have prevented the financial pressures that forced Richard to sell. The meeting proceeded with Richard taking detailed notes about digital application processes, automated underwriting systems, and customer communication protocols that would transform his traditional operation into something resembling a modern financial services company. His engagement was genuine and impressive, revealing the business acumen that had built the firm 3 decades earlier, before industry changes had outpaced his ability to adapt. I have to admit, Richard said as we reviewed integration timelines, I was skeptical about some of these technological approaches initially, but your approval rates and processing speeds are remarkable. How do you maintain quality control with such rapid turnaround times? The question provided an opening to explain Pinnacle's proprietary algorithms and data analysis capabilities, innovations that had taken years to develop and refine. As I walked Richard through our risk assessment methodology, I watched his expression shift from polite interest to genuine amazement as he grasped the sophistication of what we'd built. "This is extraordinary," he said, studying the performance metrics I'd prepared. "Your default rates are actually lower than industry averages, despite approving borrowers that traditional models would reject. How is that possible?" "Better data analysis," I explained, pulling up comparative charts on my laptop. Traditional underwriting relies on criteria developed decades ago, when economic patterns and employment structures were completely different. Our algorithms consider factors like gig economy income, student loan management patterns, and regional economic trends that provide much more accurate pictures of borrower reliability. Richard leaned back in his chair, clearly processing the implications of what I'd described. "We've been losing qualified customers for years," he admitted, with obvious frustration. "Young professionals, small business owners, people with non-traditional income streams, they all go to newer companies because we can't accommodate their situations with our existing criteria." "Those are exactly the markets where Pinnacle excels," I confirmed. "By expanding your approved borrower profiles while maintaining strict quality controls, we should be able to increase your loan volume by 40 to 50% within the first year." The projection was conservative based on our analysis of missed opportunities in Hartman's existing market territory. But I could see the impact of those numbers on Richard's understanding of what the acquisition could accomplish, not just preserving his legacy, but transforming it into something more successful than he'd ever achieved independently. After the meeting, I drove back to downtown Chicago with a profound sense of cognitive dissonance. In the space of 2 hours, I'd earned more respect and recognition from Richard Hartman than I'd received during 3 years of family interactions. His professional appreciation for my capabilities stood in stark contrast to his consistent dismissal of my achievements during personal encounters. The double life was becoming increasingly surreal, particularly as Michael's stress about his workplace situation intensified. He'd started coming home with complaints about new management, implementing changes that disrupted familiar routines, completely unaware that those changes were being orchestrated by his fiancée. "They're completely overhauling our client intake process," he complained one evening, while we cooked dinner together in my loft kitchen. "Everything's going digital, automated approval systems, new risk assessment criteria that I don't fully understand. It's like they're trying to turn us into some kind of tech company." His resistance to innovations that were already proving successful highlighted a fundamental difference in our approaches to change and adaptation. Where I saw technological advancement as essential for competitiveness, Michael saw it as threatening to the established methods that had defined his professional identity. "Maybe the changes will make your work more efficient," I suggested carefully, testing whether he could recognize the benefits of modernization. "Faster processing times usually mean happier clients and better business results." "But it's not just about efficiency," Michael replied, his frustration evident. "There's something to be said for personal relationships, for understanding clients as individuals, rather than just data points in an algorithm. Dad built this business on personal service and attention to detail." His defense of traditional methods was touching but naive. The personal service he valued had resulted in declining market share, missed opportunities, and ultimately the need to sell the business to avoid bankruptcy. The attention to detail he praised had become bureaucratic inefficiency that drove customers to competitors who could provide faster, more responsive service. "Don't you think it's possible to maintain personal relationships while using better tools?" I asked, genuinely curious about his resistance to change. "Technology should enhance customer service, not replace it." Michael shrugged, clearly unconvinced. "I guess we'll see." Dad seems cautiously optimistic about the new ownership, but change is always stressful when you've been doing things the same way for decades. His characterization of Richard as, quote, "cautiously optimistic" was interesting, given my observation that Richard was actually quite enthusiastic about Pinnacle's improvements to his operations. The disconnect suggested that Michael was either misreading his father's reactions or that Richard was presenting different faces to different family members about the acquisition. The family dynamics became even more complex during Patricia's birthday celebration at an upscale restaurant in downtown Chicago. The dinner was supposed to be an intimate family affair, but Patricia had insisted on inviting several couples from their social circle, transforming the event into another opportunity to display the Hartman family's status and connections. "Sarah, darling," Patricia said as we waited for our table, "I heard you've been quite busy with your consulting work lately. I hope you're not overcommitting yourself with all these little projects." The dismissive characterization of my professional activities had become so routine that I barely registered the insult anymore. What struck me was Patricia's complete obliviousness to the fact that her family's financial security now depended entirely on the success of my little projects. "Business has been growing steadily," I replied diplomatically, resisting the urge to provide specifics that might reveal too much. We've taken on some significant new clients recently. How wonderful, Patricia responded with the kind of fake enthusiasm that suggested she found the topic both boring and inappropriate for social conversation. Though I do hope you're saving some energy for wedding planning. We have so many decisions to make, and I'd hate for work obligations to interfere with proper preparation. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Charles and Margaret Whitfield, longtime friends of the Hartman family, whose presence always signaled Patricia's intention to showcase her family's social connections. Charles owned a successful construction company, while Margaret served on the boards of several prominent charities, exactly the kind of established, traditional success that Patricia valued. "Richard," Charles greeted my future father-in-law with genuine warmth, "I heard through the grapevine that you made some big business changes recently. Everything working out well?" The question created an immediate tension that I could feel rippling through the family group. Richard glanced briefly at Patricia, whose expression suggested she'd prefer to avoid business discussions during social occasions, before responding with careful diplomacy. "We've entered into a strategic partnership that should position us well for future growth," he said, his phrasing deliberately vague. "The financial services industry is evolving rapidly, and we wanted to make sure we could continue serving our clients effectively." Margaret Whitfield, who had always struck me as more perceptive than her husband, picked up on the underlying currents in Richard's response. "Strategic partnerships can be wonderful when they're with the right companies," she said thoughtfully. "I imagine you were quite selective about finding partners who shared your values and commitment to client service." "Absolutely," Richard confirmed, his tone warming as he discussed what was clearly a source of genuine optimism. "Pinnacle Financial Solutions has an impressive track record of innovation while maintaining high ethical standards. Their approach to customer service actually enhances the personal attention that's always been our hallmark." I nearly choked on my wine at hearing Richard praise Pinnacle's customer service philosophy to his social circle, while having no idea he was describing my company's approach. The surreal nature of receiving secondhand compliments about my own business innovations from my future father-in-law was almost overwhelming. "Pinnacle Financial," Charles repeated, clearly trying to place the name. "I don't think I'm familiar with that firm. Are they a local company?" "Based in Chicago," Richard replied, "but they're expanding rapidly throughout the Midwest. Very impressive growth trajectory for a relatively young company." Patricia's expression during this exchange revealed her discomfort with the business discussion and her particular irritation that Richard was speaking positively about any company associated with modern technological approaches. Her worldview preferred traditional, established firms with lengthy pedigrees rather than innovative newcomers who succeeded through merit rather than social connections. "Well," she interjected with obvious intent to change the subject, "I'm sure whatever arrangements you've made will work out fine. But tonight is supposed to be a celebration, not a business meeting." Her dismissal effectively ended the discussion, but I'd caught something significant in the brief exchange. Richard was genuinely proud of his partnership with Pinnacle, viewing it as a strategic success rather than a forced sale due to financial pressure. His positive attitude suggested that the integration was proceeding even better than I'd hoped, with client satisfaction and operational improvements exceeding expectations. As the evening progressed, I found myself observing the family dynamics with new perspective. Patricia's need to control conversations and maintain social appearances, Richard's careful balance between business pragmatism and family loyalty, Michael's passive acceptance of situations beyond his direct influence. All of these patterns took on different meaning when viewed through the lens of my secret knowledge about their actual circumstances. The most revealing moment came when Margaret Whitfield asked me directly about my own work, clearly attempting to include me in the adult conversation, despite Patricia's obvious preference for treating me as a peripheral figure. "Sarah, Richard mentioned that you're in financial services as well," Margaret said with genuine interest. "What's your specialty?" The question provided an opportunity to hint at my actual accomplishments without revealing specifics that might compromise my secret. "I focus on mortgage lending," I replied carefully, "particularly working with clients who have been underserved by traditional approaches." "How interesting," Margaret continued, proving more perceptive than I'd anticipated. "That sounds quite similar to what Richard was describing about his new partnership. You must have insights into the industry changes he's navigating." The observation was dangerously close to connecting dots that could expose my role in the Hartman business acquisition. I glanced at Richard, who was listening to our conversation with polite attention, but no apparent recognition of any deeper connection between my work and his recent business decisions. The industry is definitely evolving rapidly, I agreed, keeping my response general enough to avoid suspicion. Companies that can adapt to changing customer expectations while maintaining quality standards tend to thrive. Margaret nodded approvingly, but I caught a speculative look in her eyes that suggested she found something intriguing about the parallels between my described work and Richard's business situation. Her social intelligence was clearly more sophisticated than I'd initially realized, creating a potential risk to my carefully maintained compartmentalization. The evening concluded without further dangerous moments, but I left the restaurant with growing awareness that maintaining my double life was becoming increasingly complex and precarious. The psychological strain of receiving praise for my professional accomplishments while hiding my identity from the very people offering that praise was exhausting and ultimately unsustainable. The call from my accountant came on a Friday morning, while I was reviewing quarterly performance reports in my downtown office. David Martinez had been handling Pinnacle's financial affairs since our startup days, and his urgent tone immediately commanded my attention. "Sarah, we need to discuss the Hartman acquisition's impact on your personal tax situation," he said without preamble. "The IRS is going to require very specific documentation about the funding sources, and there's a potential complication with the family connection that I think you need to understand." My stomach dropped as I processed the implications of what he was suggesting. In my focus on the business and strategic aspects of the acquisition, I'd given insufficient consideration to the regulatory scrutiny that would inevitably follow such a significant transaction. "What kind of complication?" I asked, already dreading the answer. "The financial disclosure requirements for large acquisitions include detailed reporting about any personal relationships between buyers and sellers," David explained. "When the IRS reviews this transaction, they're going to discover that you purchased a business from your future father-in-law. That's going to raise questions about whether this was an arm's-length transaction or if there were any preferential terms based on family connections." The irony was bitter. After months of maintaining secrecy to avoid accusations of impropriety, I was now facing potential regulatory investigation precisely because I hadn't disclosed the family relationship that made the transaction appear suspicious. "But the terms were completely fair," I protested. "If anything, I probably paid more than necessary because I wanted to ensure Richard got full market value." "I believe that," David assured me, "and the documentation will support that position. But the optics are going to be complicated, especially if the family discovers the connection through IRS correspondence rather than through direct disclosure from you." His point was devastatingly accurate. The careful timeline I'd established for revealing the acquisition to Michael and his family was now threatened by federal reporting requirements that operated on their own schedule, completely independent of my personal relationship management strategy. "How long do we have before the IRS filing requirements become public?" I asked, already knowing that my window for controlling the narrative was rapidly closing. "The initial filings are due within 60 days of the transaction closing," David replied. "After that, there's a 90-day review period, during which the IRS might request additional documentation. If they have questions about the family relationship, they'll likely contact both parties directly." Which meant that within 4 months, Richard would almost certainly receive official correspondence identifying me as the buyer of his business, regardless of whether I was ready to have that conversation with Michael and his family. After ending the call with David, I sat in my office staring out at Lake Michigan, trying to process the collapse of my carefully constructed timeline. The secret that had given me psychological leverage over the Hartman family's condescending treatment was about to be revealed through bureaucratic processes beyond my control. That evening, Michael arrived home from work with an expression of confused concern that immediately put me on alert. He'd been growing increasingly frustrated with the changes at his workplace, but tonight his demeanor suggested something more significant than routine complaints about new procedures. "Something strange happened today," he said, accepting the glass of wine I offered while clearly wrestling with how to interpret what he'd experienced. "Dad called me into his office for a private conversation about the new ownership situation." My pulse quickened, though I maintained casual interest in my expression. "What kind of conversation?" "He wanted to know if I'd ever heard of someone named Sarah Chen," Michael continued. his tone suggesting he was still processing the implications of the question. Apparently, she's the CEO of Pinnacle Financial Solutions, the company that bought us out. Dad said she was remarkably knowledgeable about our operations and seemed to understand our client base better than most outsiders would. The moment I'd been simultaneously anticipating and dreading had arrived, though not in the way I'd expected. Richard's curiosity about the coincidence of names had prompted him to make connections that my careful compartmentalization was designed to prevent. "That's an interesting coincidence," I replied carefully, testing whether Michael would make the obvious connection himself. "Did your dad seem suspicious about the name similarity?" "He said it was probably just a coincidence, but he was curious enough to ask," Michael answered, his expression suggesting he was beginning to consider possibilities that hadn't occurred to him previously. "Sarah, you don't think— there couldn't be any connection between your consulting work and this Pinnacle company, could there?" The direct question created a moment of truth that I wasn't prepared to handle. Lying outright would compound the deception and make the eventual revelation even more damaging to our relationship. But confirming his suspicions would require immediate explanations that I wasn't ready to provide. "Why would you think there might be a connection?" I asked, deflecting while trying to understand how much Richard had actually pieced together. "Because Dad mentioned that this Sarah Chen seemed to know things about our business that would be unusual for an outside buyer," Michael replied, his investigative instincts finally beginning to engage. "Specific details about client relationships, operational inefficiencies, market opportunities that we've never discussed publicly. It's like she had inside knowledge of our strengths and weaknesses." His observation was accurate, but dangerous. My due diligence research had been thorough, but I'd also relied on insights gained through 3 years of listening to Michael's casual comments about workplace frustrations and family business discussions. The combination had given me advantages that would be difficult to explain without revealing the personal connection. "That does sound unusual," I agreed, maintaining neutrality while my mind raced through possible responses to the questions that were clearly coming. "Maybe she's just very good at business analysis." Michael's expression suggested he found that explanation insufficient. "Dad also mentioned that she's around our age, which is pretty young for someone running a company large enough to acquire established firms like ours." It made him wonder about her background and experience. The conversation was spiraling toward inevitable revelation, and I realized that my carefully planned timeline was completely irrelevant now. Richard's natural curiosity and business instincts were driving him toward connections that would expose my identity within days, regardless of my preferences for timing or context. "Michael," I began, recognizing that honesty was now the only viable option, "there's something important I need to tell you about my work." Before I could continue, his phone rang with a call from Patricia. The interruption was both frustrating and providential, giving me a few more minutes to consider how to frame the revelation that would fundamentally alter our relationship dynamics. "Mom," Michael answered, his tone suggesting he was expecting another social obligation or family update. His expression quickly shifted to surprise and concern as he listened to whatever Patricia was telling him. "What do you mean someone's been asking questions about Sarah?" he said, his eyes meeting mine with obvious alarm. "What kind of questions?" My blood ran cold as I realized that Patricia had somehow become involved in Richard's investigation of the name coincidence. Her social networking instincts and natural suspicion of outsiders made her a dangerous addition to any inquiry about my background or professional activities. "Slow down, Mom," Michael continued, clearly struggling to follow Patricia's rapid-fire explanation. "You called Margaret Whitfield about what exactly?" The mention of Margaret's name confirmed my worst fears. Patricia had obviously been bothered by the dinner conversation, where Margaret had noted similarities between my work and Richard's business partnership. Her decision to follow up with additional investigation showed a level of proactive suspicion that I'd underestimated. "I'll call you back," Michael said, ending the conversation with obvious frustration. He turned to me with an expression that combined confusion, concern, and the beginning of suspicion. "Mom says Margaret Whitfield called her with questions about your background and professional experience. Apparently, Margaret thought there were some interesting coincidences between what you do and Dad's recent business changes." The investigation was now involving multiple family members and their social connections, creating a web of inquiry that was rapidly closing around my carefully maintained secret. Margaret's social intelligence, which I'd recognized as potentially problematic during the birthday dinner, had apparently prompted her to make connections that threatened my compartmentalization strategy. "What kind of questions?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the direction of Margaret's thinking. "Professional questions," Michael replied, his tone suggesting he was beginning to find the coincidences too numerous to dismiss. "About your client base, your company's size, your expansion plans." Margaret apparently has some connections in the financial services industry, and she was curious about whether you might be associated with any of the companies involved in recent acquisitions. The professional networking that made Margaret valuable to Patricia's social circle was now threatening to expose connections I'd worked hard to conceal. Her access to industry information and her willingness to investigate unusual coincidences created risks I hadn't adequately considered. "Michael," I said, recognizing that the conversation could no longer be delayed or deflected, "I think we need to sit down and talk about some things I should have told you earlier." His expression shifted to something approaching dread, as if he was beginning to grasp that whatever I was about to reveal would significantly complicate his understanding of our relationship and his family's recent business decisions. "This is about more than just coincidences, isn't it?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of resignation that suggested he was preparing for revelations he might not want to hear. "Yes," I confirmed, gesturing toward the living room where we could have the conversation that would determine whether our relationship could survive the weight of secrets I'd been carrying. "It's about much more than coincidences." As we settled onto the couch where we'd shared countless evenings of ordinary domestic life, I realized that I was about to fundamentally alter the balance of power in our relationship and potentially destroy the future we'd been planning together. The secret that had given me psychological strength was about to become the test of whether our marriage could be built on a foundation of honesty rather than carefully managed perceptions. The next few minutes would determine whether Michael could accept that the woman he'd been condescending to about her little consulting business had actually acquired his family's company and was now, in effect, his employer. More importantly, it would reveal whether he could respect my success when it couldn't be dismissed or minimized by his family's social hierarchy. "Sarah," Michael said, his voice quiet with the gravity of whatever he was beginning to understand, "please tell me what's really going on." The moment of truth had arrived, not according to my careful timeline, but according to the inexorable logic of secrets that eventually demand disclosure. Whether our relationship would survive what I was about to reveal remained to be seen, but the era of living a double life was finally irrevocably over. The conversation with Michael lasted 3 hours, during which I watched our relationship transform from one of supposed equals to something far more complex and potentially unstable. His initial shock at learning I owned Pinnacle Financial Solutions gave way to a mixture of amazement, hurt, and what I recognized as a wounded masculine pride that I'd anticipated but hoped to avoid. "You've been my employer for 6 months, he said repeatedly, as if saying it aloud would help him process the reality. Every day I complained about work changes, about new management policies, about feeling disconnected from business decisions. I was complaining to the person making those decisions. His hurt was legitimate, and I accepted responsibility for the deception while trying to help him understand the circumstances that had made honesty feel impossible. "I wanted to tell you," I explained, "but every time I tried to discuss my business seriously, your family would dismiss it as unimportant. I started to feel like my success would only be acknowledged if it was dramatic enough to be undeniable." Michael's response revealed the depth of his family's influence on his perception of appropriate relationship dynamics. "But this isn't just success, Sarah. This is you secretly controlling my family's financial future while letting us treat you like—" He paused, clearly struggling with the implications of how I'd been treated versus what I'd actually accomplished. "Like what?" I prompted gently, recognizing that his completion of that sentence would determine whether our relationship could survive this revelation. "Like someone who didn't understand business," he admitted reluctantly. "Like someone who needed our guidance and acceptance, rather than someone who was already more successful than any of us." His acknowledgement was progress, but his tone suggested resentment rather than admiration for what I'd built. The psychological dynamics that had allowed his family to dismiss my achievements weren't easily overcome simply by revealing their magnitude. We agreed that I would tell Richard and Patricia myself before they discovered the truth through their investigations or IRS correspondence. Michael wanted to be present for the conversation, though I suspected his motivation was more about damage control than support for my position. The family dinner at Romano's Steakhouse 3 days later was supposed to be a celebration of Patricia's recent charity board appointment, another opportunity for her to showcase the family's social prominence. I'd chosen the location deliberately, wanting neutral territory that carried no psychological advantage for either side when the inevitable confrontation occurred. Patricia arrived in her signature pearls and Chanel suit, radiating the confidence of someone accustomed to controlling family dynamics through force of personality and social positioning. Richard appeared somewhat distracted, clearly still processing his growing suspicions about my identity and connection to Pinnacle. "Sarah, darling," Patricia greeted me with her usual air of patronizing affection. "I hope you're not planning to monopolize Michael's attention tonight with talk about your little business ventures. We have important family matters to discuss." The dismissive reference to my little business ventures provided the perfect opening for the revelation I'd been planning. After we'd ordered drinks and settled into the private dining room I'd reserved, I decided to address Patricia's concerns about monopolizing conversation. "Actually, Patricia," I said, maintaining the calm tone I'd practiced for this moment, "I think you'll find tonight's business discussion quite relevant to your family's interests." She looked puzzled by my departure from the usual pattern of deferential responses to her social management attempts. Richard's attention sharpened, as if he sensed that whatever was coming would address the questions that had been troubling him. "Michael and I have something important to share with you both," I continued, retrieving the folder I'd brought specifically for this conversation. "It concerns your recent business partnership and some connections you may not have realized existed." Patricia's expression shifted to mild alarm as she recognized that I was taking control of the conversation in a way that suggested significant news. "What kind of connections?" she asked, her tone carrying a warning that I was approaching topics beyond my proper sphere of family influence. "The kind that explain why Richard found my name coincidentally familiar," I replied, sliding copies of Pinnacle Financial Solutions corporate documents across the table. "And why I seemed unusually knowledgeable about Hartman Financial Group's operations and market position." Richard picked up the documents immediately, his business instincts engaging as he processed what he was seeing. Patricia remained suspicious but clearly uncertain about what the papers represented or why I thought they were relevant to family dinner conversation. "Sarah Chen," Richard read aloud from the corporate filings, "Chief Executive Officer and Primary Shareholder, Pinnacle Financial Solutions." He looked up at me with an expression that combined recognition, amazement, and what might have been the beginning of respect. "You're the buyer. You purchased my company." "Yes," I confirmed, meeting his gaze directly. "I acquired Hartman Financial Group 6 months ago because it represented a strategic opportunity to expand Pinnacle's regional market presence while preserving a respected legacy in the industry." The silence that followed was profound and loaded with implications that each family member was processing differently. Richard's expression suggested he was rapidly reevaluating every interaction we'd had, both personal and professional. Michael looked simultaneously proud and uncomfortable, clearly uncertain about whether my revelation reflected positively or negatively on our relationship. Patricia's reaction was the most volatile. Her face cycled through confusion, disbelief, and mounting indignation as she grasped the implications of what I'd revealed. "This is ridiculous," she declared, her voice carrying the authority she was accustomed to wielding in family discussions. "You're claiming to own a multi-million-dollar business? Sarah, this fantasy has gone far enough." Her dismissal, even in the face of documented evidence, revealed the depth of her psychological need to maintain the social hierarchy that positioned me as dependent rather than powerful. The cognitive dissonance of acknowledging my success was apparently too threatening to her worldview to be accepted even with proof. "It's not a claim, Mom," Michael intervened, his tone suggesting he was struggling with his own conflicted feelings about the situation. "I've seen the paperwork. Sarah really does own Pinnacle, which means she's been employing Dad and me for the past 6 months." Patricia turned to Richard with an expression demanding that he contradict what she was hearing. Richard, tell them this is impossible. Tell them this girl couldn't possibly own the company that bought your business. But Richard's response wasn't what she expected. Actually, he said slowly, his businessman's pragmatism overriding social considerations. It explains quite a lot. Miss Chen's, Sarah's, knowledge of our operations, her strategic vision for integration, her understanding of our market challenges. I wondered how someone so young could demonstrate such sophisticated industry expertise. His professional admiration was gratifying, but I could see Patricia's mounting fury at being contradicted by the very person she'd expected to support her dismissal of my claims. This is unacceptable, she declared, her voice rising with the kind of anger that came from losing control of a situation she'd expected to dominate. Michael, you cannot possibly marry someone who has been deceiving our entire family for months. The dishonesty alone disqualifies her from consideration as a suitable wife. The attack was direct and personal, designed to force Michael to choose between his family's approval and his relationship with me. Her strategy was transparent. If she couldn't deny my success, she would use that success to paint me as manipulative and untrustworthy. The dishonesty was necessary, I replied, maintaining composure despite the personal nature of her attack, because honest discussion of my achievements was consistently dismissed or minimized in this family. Every attempt I made to share my professional success was met with suggestions that I focus on more appropriate priorities. More appropriate priorities like being a supportive wife, Patricia shot back, instead of someone who secretly controls her fiancé's employment while pretending to be grateful for his family's acceptance. Her characterization was designed to reframe my success as evidence of manipulation rather than accomplishment, but it also revealed her fundamental misunderstanding of what had actually transpired. I was never pretending to be grateful for acceptance, I corrected firmly. I was hoping to earn respect for my actual achievements rather than my willingness to diminish myself to fit your expectations of what Michael's wife should be. Richard, who had been listening to this exchange with growing concern, finally intervened. Patricia, regardless of how we feel about the secrecy, we can't ignore the fact that Sarah has probably saved our business. The improvements to operations, the increased approval rates, the technological upgrades, they've transformed what we do. His professional assessment carried weight that Patricia couldn't easily dismiss, but her response revealed the depth of her investment in maintaining social hierarchies that my success had disrupted. I don't care if she's Warren Buffett, Patricia declared, her fury now completely unconstrained. She lied to our family for months while positioning herself as our financial superior. That level of calculated deception is unforgivable. The moment had arrived for my final card, the revelation that would demonstrate just how completely the power dynamics had shifted during the months of my supposed inferiority. Patricia, I said, retrieving one more document from my folder, there's something else you should know about my business activities. I placed the mortgage documentation in front of her with careful deliberation. Pinnacle Financial Solutions doesn't just provide business loans. We also handle residential mortgages, including the loan on your house at 1247 Elm Grove Drive in Brookfield Heights. The blood drained from Patricia's face as she processed what I was showing her. What are you saying? I'm saying that your mortgage payment comes to my company every month, I explained with calm precision. You've been making house payments to the woman you've spent 3 years calling a freeloader, who doesn't understand financial responsibility. The revelation hit with the force I'd intended. Patricia stared at the mortgage documents as if they were written in a foreign language, her social confidence crumbling as she grasped the implications of what I'd revealed. This is impossible, she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. The mortgage was transferred to Pinnacle as part of a portfolio acquisition 8 months ago, I continued. Every payment you've made since then has been processed by the company you've been dismissing as my little consulting business. Richard's expression had shifted to something approaching awe. Sarah, do you realize what you've accomplished? You've built something extraordinary. His professional admiration was deeply satisfying, but the family dynamics had clearly reached a breaking point that would require careful navigation. Patricia sat in stunned silence, her worldview apparently too shattered to formulate immediate responses. Michael, caught between his family's crisis and his relationship with me, struggled to find words that could address the magnitude of what had been revealed. Sarah, he said finally, I need time to process all of this. The business success is incredible, but the secrecy. I don't know how to reconcile everything." His response was disappointing, but not surprising. Even faced with undeniable evidence of my capabilities, he remained focused on the deception, rather than the circumstances that had made honesty feel impossible. "Take all the time you need," I replied, gathering my documents with the dignity I'd maintained throughout the confrontation. "But while you're processing, remember that every criticism your family made about my work ethic, my financial understanding, and my suitability as a wife was wrong. Not mistaken, wrong." I stood to leave, recognizing that the evening had accomplished what I'd intended. Complete reversal of the power dynamics that had defined our relationship for 3 years. "Where are you going?" Michael asked, clearly unprepared for the conversation to end so definitively. "Home," I said simply, "to plan the next phase of Pinnacle's expansion into Wisconsin and Indiana markets. Unlike some people, I have a business empire to run." As I walked out of Romano's Steakhouse, leaving the Hartman family to process the ruins of their assumptions about my worth and capabilities, I felt a profound sense of liberation. The secret that had weighed on me for months was finally revealed. The double life that had exhausted me was finally ended, and the people who had questioned my value had finally seen the full scope of what I'd accomplished. 6 months later, I received a wedding invitation in the mail. Michael was marrying someone Patricia had found more suitable, a kindergarten teacher whose ambitions would never threaten the family's need to feel superior to their son's choice of wife. I sent an expensive wedding gift from the catalog Patricia had registered with, along with a card that simply read, "Wishing you both all the happiness you deserve. Sarah Chen, CEO, Pinnacle Financial Solutions." The morning after I sent that gift, I received a call from Margaret Whitfield asking if I'd be interested in acquiring her husband's construction company. Apparently, word was spreading in certain circles that I was the right kind of buyer for family businesses that needed both capital investment and modern management. I told her I'd be delighted to discuss the opportunity over lunch. After all, I had a reputation to maintain as someone who understood the real value of established family enterprises, and the even greater value of having the resources to acquire them when their owners finally realized what they were really worth. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.